My sister laughed, her voice sharp enough to cut through silk. "You're wearing that to your wedding," but I walked in wearing white. 4 stars on my shoulder. 200 seals rose in unison and shouted "Admiral" on deck. My family didn't stand. My team did. In that moment, I realized blood had abandoned me, but steel never would. Before I share my story, I'd love to know you are here with me. Just drop a simple hi in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection makes the hardest story easier to carry. Thank you. And now, here's my story. If my words touch you, please consider subscribing. It helps more than you know, not just for me, but for the message I'm trying to carry. My name is Zinnia Voss, and this is the truth of how I became Steel Bloom. The morning light cut through the hangar at Pearl Harbor, Hickam, white beams slicing the dust, as if even the air wanted discipline. My shoes echoed on the steel floor, the scent of machine oil faint in the air, the flag casting a long shadow that reached my boots. I stood there in my white dress uniform, tugging the sash flat, testing the weight of my shoulder boards, reminding myself I was not just a bride, I was an officer, and this ceremony would not be stripped of its honor. Julian checked his watch, calm as ever, whispering that my vows mattered more than any noise beyond these walls. Theo Knox rehearsed the saber arch blades clashing in a crisp, metallic rhythm, each strike sharp as thunder. Chaplain Tate murmured scripture about order and peace, words I tucked in my chest pocket like armor. My phone buzzed. Sienna's tweet glared at me, Khan Control Bride, with a photo she had doctored mocking my uniform, calling it a symbol of obsession. Within minutes, the hashtag rose like wildfire, journalists circling the gate with cameras, one producer offering me a chance to defend myself live. I felt the burn rise in my chest, the old instinct to fight back with words to prove her wrong in front of the world. But I raised my hand to the unit instead, signaling them to continue the rehearsal. My silence was not surrender. It was a choice, a weapon sharper than her laughter. Then an email came through from a cadet at Great Lakes. She called herself a future Steelheart and begged to watch the ceremony from afar. Her message slipped past the noise, and for a moment I remembered what mattered. This day wasn't for the audience outside. It was for those who had learned to endure the storm. When I stepped under the arch of blades, the sound of steel on steel echoed like a hymn. Each clash pulled me back to my mother's voice years ago. Storms forge iron flowers. I carried that line with me into every battle, every inspection, every lonely night, when silence was the only friend left, but the storm was still brewing. As I left the rehearsal, one of the officers approached, voice low with something between pride and warning. Tomorrow, he said, nearly 200 SEALs plan to show up uninvited to honor me in their own way. It should have been a promise of strength, but all I heard was the ticking of a clock. Were they coming to protect me, or to turn my wedding into a spectacle for every camera waiting outside? I didn't know. And I wasn't sure silence would be enough this time. To understand why I stayed quiet, you'd have to go back to Portland long before uniforms and medals, when rain seeped into every crack of the city and into me. I grew up in a house where silence wasn't just survival, it was the only language I owned. At the dinner table, Sienna would flash her perfect smile for the guests, then slam her heel into my shin beneath the linen. When I flinched, she laughed, calling me too fierce, making sure everyone saw me as the odd one. My father nodded at her charm. My mother's eyes darted to mine with quiet apology. One winter morning, I found my locker decorated with a wilted flower pinned with tape. Sienna had done it the day I was meant to recite one of my mother's poems at the school club. A reminder that whatever bloomed in me, she could crush. That night, my mother pressed a folded slip of paper into my hand. In her delicate handwriting, "Storms forge iron flowers." I tucked it inside a cheap plastic wallet, carried it everywhere. It was the first seed of the silence I learned to weaponize. By then, I was already watching the Navy newsreels, sketching docs in the margins of my notebooks, timing my runs along the Willamette, even in the rain. Portland rain has a way of cutting skin without breaking it, and I let it carve me into someone who could hold her ground without speaking. I told no one, but I was preparing for the academy. I memorized drill commands from borrowed manuals, practiced making my bed to inspection standards, while Sienna rehearsed speeches in the living room. When the day came to submit my application, I discovered the letter of recommendation, the one document that proved I belonged, had vanished. The envelope was torn, the paper clip bent, lying in the drawer we both used. No evidence, no witness, only silence. I could have shouted, accused, begged. Instead, I stapled together what I had left and mailed it in. If I failed, it would be on me. My father praised Sienna's debate victory that week, barely glancing at me. I learned something sharper than anger in that moment, that emotion wasted in the open only feeds the people who want you small. I locked my jaw, kept running in the rain. Then, just when I was sure the silence had cost me everything, an official envelope arrived. My application was still alive, but only if I could produce that missing recommendation within 10 days. Relief and dread wrestled in my chest. Who had pulled my file back from the edge? Who had slipped behind the curtain to save me? I folded my mother's note again, pressed it flat as if it were a medal. Storms forge iron flowers. I didn't know yet what storm was coming, but I understood the lesson: silence wasn't the absence of words. It was the ground beneath them, the steel that would hold me when everything else bent or broke. And it was only the beginning. Fog slid off the Severn like breath on glass the morning I reported for plebe summer. The field crackled under boots. The brass bell by Bancroft Hall rang too bright, and every order landed like a nail. The first weeks were an audit of my existence. How tight I tied my laces, how square I made a hospital corner, how quickly I answered to my name without wasting a syllable. I kept a pocket notebook that bled through with sweat, logging every correction without arguing. Listen, note, fix, repeat. When a squad leader baited me for a reaction, I swallowed the heat and adjusted the angle of a salute by 2 degrees. Silence wasn't retreat. It was leverage. Lieutenant Nora Sterling taught Leadership Lab with the kind of economy that made everyone stand straighter. She watched in a way that told you she could measure your pulse by your posture. When she graded my first systems drill, she said only, "Do it again, but slower." I did, breaking down a supply triage plan step by step until the map looked like a spine. In systems theory later that month, I ran a crisis supply chain simulation during a mock port closure. When the board lit green instead of red, the instructor glanced at my file and said one word under his breath: unbreakable. I pretended not to hear it, because the minute you reach for praise, it slides out of your hand. News from Portland still found its way into the barracks. A classmate passed me a phone during chow, and there was Sienna on a local station calling military graduation a costume camp, splicing parade footage into a punchline. The clip skipped from face to face and landed on mine, freeze-framed in mid-salute. Laughter leaked around the table. I slid the phone back and laced my fingers so they wouldn't shake. The next morning, I ran 5 miles along the water in air so cold it tasted metallic, then made my rack until the sheet looked like a pane of ice. You don't answer noise with noise. You outlast it. On the fall field exercise, we were dropped into damp woods with a navigation packet and a timetable that left no room for error. A classmate started slurring words at checkpoint 3, skin chalk, pale fingers clumsy on his compass. I called a halt and moved him behind a windbreak, assigned heat packs, and a dry layer ordered steady sips, took his map, and redistributed weight. One cadet protested we'd miss the window. "We don't pass a test by losing a person," I said, and set a new pace. We hit the extraction lane 5 minutes under with everyone upright. Lieutenant Sterling watched from the tree line, wrote something on her clipboard, and met my eye for a second that felt like an oath. Ezra Cole was the first in my squad to call me ma'am without the wink that made the title a joke. It happened after midnight during watch, when the hallway was a river of fluorescence and the bell's last echo hung in the ceiling. He handed me a thermos and said, "You're making us better, ma'am," like he was stating weather. I didn't thank him. I didn't need to. The acknowledgement settled where anger used to live. Near the end of first semester, I learned why my application had survived the missing letter. A clerk in admissions, a friend of my mother's old contact in the Pentagon, sent a short note through internal mail to Lieutenant Sterling, who passed it to me after drill. My mother had guessed something was wrong when I went quiet about the application, and without ceremony sent a clean copy of the recommendation straight to the office, citing a prior relationship for verification. No speech, no confrontation. Just the right paper at the right desk in the right hour. I held the note long enough for my hands to warm it, then folded it into the notebook with the corrections I'd lived by. I didn't confront Sienna. Proof of sabotage would become a theater I refused to attend. I owed my mother a debt measured in breath. The bell took on a second meaning, that winter less a summons and more a covenant. Every time it rang, I pictured the stubborn slip of paper in my wallet, the one that said, "Storms forge iron flowers." On nights when fluorescent light sharpened the edges of everything, I read it once and went back to work. Graduation came with sunshine and brass. My cap sat level. My gloves were clean. My name sounded simple through the loudspeakers. I scanned the stands. My mother held a small bouquet and her mouth trembled. My father clapped cleanly as if he were applauding an air show. The seat beside them stayed empty. I looked away before the camera could trap my face. When the band struck the last note, I walked off the field, not lighter but steadier. The silence I carried out of Annapolis was different from the one I brought in. The first had been survival. The second was command. Orders sent me west. Fort Lewis waited with its damp concrete, its suspicion, and the work that would prove whether my kind of quiet could lead in rooms that preferred the sound of themselves. I packed my bell-shined shoes, my notebook swollen with salt, and the paper that had saved me, and I headed into weather I had trained my whole life to meet. Tacoma mist slicked the morning like a thin film of ice when I first walked into the warehouse that would become my proof. The lights were harsh enough to wash faces to bone, the coffee in the duty office smelled burnt, and the inventory system wheezed like an old engine. I was a second lieutenant with orders to tame a logistics chain that had learned to run on excuses. The first week I listened. I traced every pallet's itinerary, logged temperature failures, timed loadouts with a second hand, and mapped the gaps no one wanted to claim. By the end of the second week, I had a checklist that could have doubled as a confession. They called me frostbite before the month was out. It was meant to mean cold, humorless, too stiff to belong. I answered with numbers. I posted a plan that reflowed bin placement by demand, frequency, revised inspection cadence, and cut duplications that made emergencies inevitable. We started counting losses in single digits instead of cases. 3 months in, errors dropped by half. I didn't celebrate. I circled the next problem in red. Tucker Holt, a sergeant who'd seen more field days than I'd had birthdays, hated the sight of me on principle. In a briefing, he barked, "What does a paper officer know about the fight? I didn't take the bait." I laid out the before and after figures, time to issue shaved by 38 minutes per request. Mispicks reduced a late part that didn't miss a patrol because we'd rerouted the process the week prior. "My job is to make sure you don't go hungry in contact," I said. The room didn't clap. It didn't have to. Holt narrowed his eyes and stopped shaking his head. Diego Reyes became the gut check I never wanted. An accident on the line took his leg below the knee, and the first hours were a blur of rotors and grit. I rode to the airstrip with him, hand on the straps, counting breaths between pain spikes, giving reports that kept the medics steady. When he could speak, he fixed me with a look that bore more weight than rank. "Don't let anyone tell you you don't belong here," he rasped. I carried that sentence back to the warehouse and hung it on the wall where no one could see it but me. Captain Silas Grant pinned the unit patch on me the following quarter, quick and simple, no speech. The pin bit my skin through the fabric, and I decided to keep that sting as part of the patch. Recognition landed quiet, like most of the good things in uniform do. Then the internet arrived in the barracks like a rumor with teeth. A Seattle account aired a segment featuring my sister laughing into a microphone while a parade rolled by on a loop. She called me a robot in a costume while graphics joked over my face. Some of the younger guys watched on their phones between shifts, muttering and snorting, and the nickname Frostbite picked up a colder edge. I kept writing plans on whiteboards, covered my hands in dust and marker ink, and answered nothing. Late winter, the warehouse bit back. A training day moved faster than prudence. A device cooked off where it shouldn't have, and heat punched through the aisle. I didn't think. I moved. Smoke crawled the rafters and boxes went bright at the corners, and in that tunnel I saw Holt, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, stooping for a lock, like he could hold the blast down with his grip. I grabbed his harness and yanked. We hit the concrete on our elbows, slid behind a stack, and the flare burned itself mean and short. He glared at me like he wanted to fight, then wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and laughed once raw. "You've got steel frostbite," he said, breathing hard. After that, he stopped calling me paper. A letter from my mother arrived the next week in plain stationery with a Portland return address. Inside a single line, "Don't fear silence. It makes people listen harder." I folded it small, tucked it where I kept the other line she'd given me, and went back to the floor. There's a patience to logistics that has nothing to do with waiting and everything to do with refusing to be rushed by someone else's panic. When Reyes came back to visit with his new leg, he rolled faster than anyone expected, and the crew gave him a path like water around a rock. We stood near the loading bay where the wind cut through clean. He said he wanted in on the efficiency drills to show the new guys what stubborn looks like. I wrote his name at the top of the list and stared at the pen mark until it dried. Holt found me after hours one night leaning against a stack of crates with his cap shoved back. The warehouse light made him look older, but his voice carried different. "If that sister of yours ever tries to march cameras through our gate," he said, "I'll be the one standing at your shoulder." I didn't ask how he knew or why he cared. I nodded, and the pact settled between us like a weight we both could carry. By spring, the numbers held. The joke softened. The nickname stuck, but it changed temperature. Frostbite came to mean the one who didn't blink, the one who kept the line moving in weather no one wanted. I didn't need them to love me. I needed them to do their jobs and get home. Still, when the day ended and the coffee burned low, the glow of a phone could throw the whole room back into noise. Seattle never ran out of commentary. I learned to thread my way through it without catching to leave it to fray behind me. What mattered were the pallets that made it to the convoy, the men who didn't run dry because the math held the quiet way. A patch can anchor you to a place you have to earn twice. The orders that would send me farther past the warehouse, into places where the ground radiated heat and maps lied, were already in a printer tray somewhere. I could feel them humming in the air. When they came, I'd take the numbers and the names: Reyes's promise, Holt's grudging guard, and the two small lines from my mother that stitched all my choices together. The nickname would come with me, and I'd let it. Out there, winter had nothing to do with weather. The air in Mogadishu carried dust thick enough to coat your teeth. Red grit swirled with the echo of distant gunfire, the smell of gun oil and scorched metal riding the wind. Patrol days blurred into nights, but one afternoon carved itself into my bones. Riley Kane went down under fire, blood soaking into sand so hot it steamed. Bullets cracked against walls while his breathing turned ragged. I didn't think. I dropped low, hauled him by his harness, dragging inch by inch through dirt that spit fire. Owen Slade covered our flank, shouting directions I barely heard. By the time we cleared the line and medics took him, my arms shook with exhaustion. Riley looked at me through the haze and whispered, "You just saved me from the desert." That night, the squad started calling me Steel Bloom, a flower that didn't wilt but cut its way open in the sand. Bahrain brought fire of a different kind. A fuel depot lit up without warning, a column of black smoke tearing into the sky. The blast threw me flat, heat peeling the skin on my palms as I scrambled. Carter Finch appeared through the haze, arms strong enough to pull me from a corridor of flame that wanted to keep me. My ears rang for hours, but his grip stayed steady. We stumbled into salt air, coughing until our throats burned. That night, I wrote a single line in my notebook. Silence keeps you alive when screams would only feed the fire. But silence could not save Sergeant Leo Brooks. He was steady in drills, quiet in barracks, never the loudest, never the weakest. One morning, he was gone. On his bunk, a folded note addressed to me. Your silence was where I felt safe. Thank you. My chest broke open reading it. No parade or medal could cover the weight of losing him. I carried that wound into every meeting, every operation that followed. I decided the system had to change. From those ashes came Operation Iron Haven, a push for mental health reform inside commands that had long treated suffering as weakness. I filed reports, built data, forced conversations that commanders wanted to dodge. Some rolled their eyes, some fought me, but the tide shifted grain by grain. Still outside my control, Sienna reached for my shadow. She produced a documentary about darkness in the military using footage of me without permission, branding me the shadow leader. Cameras loved her voice, and once again my image was bent into her performance. On screens, I looked like a ghost. In reality, I was carrying names carved in my hands. Then something unexpected happened. Online chatter turned. What started as sarcasm, Kinishik Steelbloom. The nickname meant to cut morphed into a banner people raised in solidarity. Families of soldiers I'd fought beside, wives of men who came home scarred. Strangers who had only read the headlines began using it as a mark of respect. Steel Bloom became less insult, more shield. One envelope arrived with childish handwriting. A little girl wrote that her parents had named her Ember because of the fire I had walked through. She said, "When I grow up, I want to be strong like you." I held that letter longer than I had ever held any award. In San Diego, during a strategy session on Iron Haven, a senior officer leaned back and said, "Your silence terrifies men more than 1,000 speeches." He meant it half as praise, half as warning. I carried both parts. Silence was my weapon, but it was also the weight pressing down on my chest. When I finally opened my inbox after another endless day of reports, there was an email from someone named Julian Hart, a civilian analyst, precise and thoughtful. His words were simple. "I think your silence has changed the numbers, and it's changing me too." For the first time in years, silence wasn't just mine to carry. Someone else had noticed. San Diego smelled of salt and sun, the kind of light that makes you believe in new beginnings. Julian and I had traded messages for months, our conversations slipping from policy to books, to the rhythms of everyday life. When we finally met in person, there was no ceremony, no hesitation. He was quiet like me, but not because of wounds, because he believed listening mattered more than speaking. One evening, with no audience, he asked me to marry him. No ring in a spotlight, no staged photographs, just his words. "We don't need a stage, we just need the truth." As plans formed, Sienna returned to her old role, this time with sharper tools. She posted a tweet with a photo of my uniform tagged with the words, "Gosh, control bride." She mocked the idea of a wedding in dress whites, claimed I was obsessed with power. The hashtag spread like smoke. But then something changed. Veterans I had served with began posting their own stories under Phoenix Steel Bloom wedding. Families added photographs recounting the times I had pulled their sons from fire or stood in hospital rooms when no one else came. The tide flipped. What she meant as ridicule became a wall of solidarity. Yet shadows kept creeping in. An anonymous email landed in my inbox with a recording from an internal meeting warning me that Sienna intended to push press crews directly to the base gates on the day of the ceremony. It wasn't just about me, it was about turning the event into her broadcast. Then came my father. Graham told me flatly that if I wore the uniform, he wouldn't walk inside the chapel. He said it would make our family a spectacle. The words stung, but not as much as the look in his eyes, that same dismissal I had known since childhood. I didn't argue. Silence again became my armor. Late one night, I walked in on Julian folding a newspaper, his jaw tight. The headline blared, "Steel Bloom Bride" or "Brigadier." He had crumpled the corner, clearly fighting the urge to protect me by carrying the insult himself. I touched his hand, reminded him that no headline had ever defined me. His silence in that moment was different. It was love, holding back fire for my sake. Rehearsals at Pearl Harbor revealed something I had not expected. When I stepped into the hangar, over 200 SEALs stood lined in formation blades, polished, preparing a saber arch far beyond the official program. They were not on the guest list, not scheduled, not ordered. They came because they chose to. It should have been comforting, but it rattled me. Would their presence be seen as honor or defiance? Would cameras twist it into theater? On the eve of the wedding, I lay awake listening to the drums of rehearsal echo against steel walls, wondering if my vow could withstand the noise waiting outside. By dawn, press vans would be parked at the gates. Sienna was already teasing a live broadcast. My father's absence was guaranteed. As I adjusted my gloves, the question I had carried since childhood pressed heavier than the medals on my chest. Would silence be enough to protect the sanctity of this day, or would I finally need to break it? The arch of steel waited, the cameras waited. My team waited. The answer would come when I stepped forward. The hangar smelled of salt and steel, the flag above us, heavy as if it carried the whole weight of the Pacific. Light poured through the high windows, dust turning gold in the beams' boots, striking in unison until the floor itself seemed to breathe. My heart beat slow and deliberate, louder than the drums outside. I walked forward, the saber arch rising like a cathedral of blades, 200 swords gleaming as they lifted in perfect symmetry. Silence swept the room, every eye on me, until the only sound left was the cadence of my steps. The first clash of heels came like thunder. Then the cry broke open, "Admiral on deck." The sound rolled through the hangar, layered with the strength of men who had survived deserts and oceans. The cameras rattled, but their lenses couldn't own the moment. It belonged to us. The title wasn't mine, but they gave it anyway, an act of defiance and respect, louder than any headline. At the threshold stood my father, stiff-backed, his face unreadable. He never crossed the line. He turned and walked away, leaving the shadow of absence heavier than his presence would have been. For a second my body faltered, my throat, catching on a truth I had long known: some doors never open, even for family. Julian's hand closed around mine, anchoring me back to the vow I had chosen. Wyatt Stone stepped forward, his voice carrying steady, though his eyes burned. He spoke of his brother who had fallen years before, how he believed his brother's spirit still stood in the ranks with us. "He's here today," Wyatt said, "and he's saluting you." Around us, men who had never wept in uniform wiped their eyes. In the blur of ceremony, someone pressed an envelope into my palm. Inside was a note from Diego Reyes, written with the uneven scrawl of a man still learning to balance on his new leg. "We stand here because you made us whole." I closed it inside my glove, fingers shaking. Then the crack in the world came. Sienna's broadcast faltered on the giant screen, her polished voice stuttering. The feed shifted, exposing a reel of her laughing backstage, mocking the very uniform she had once tried to reduce me to. The audience gasped, then murmured, the tide of opinion shifting with the swiftness of wind off the sea. For the first time, the cameras didn't protect her. They betrayed her. Chaplain Tate paused mid-script, his Bible resting at his side. His voice rose quiet and unshakable. "You are not just marrying a man today. You are marrying the legacy you built with your hands, your silence, your blood. This union is not just of two people, but of the truth you've carried." The hangar erupted with applause that shook the rafters. Julian's vows came soft-spoken, as if meant only for me, yet the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. When it was my turn, I spoke few words. I didn't need more. As we sealed them, the seals lowered their blades and struck them against the floor steel, ringing in rhythm until the hanger became a drum of defiance. Revenge wasn't in my voice, but in the sound of those blades, proof that silence had never been weakness. As the last note faded, Sienna slipped out through the side door, her crew in tow, her face pale beneath studio makeup. Her silence now was not strength, but collapse. I knew the war with her wasn't entirely over, but for the first time the world had seen the line drawn. I wasn't just the sister she mocked. I was Steel Bloom, and the proof stood in steel and vows behind me. Months after the wedding, Charleston carried me into a different hall, softer than steel but no less weighted. The women's military conference filled the air with the hum of voices, gold light spilling over tables and faces hungry for change. I spoke of silence, not as absence, but as command, how it had shaped reform, how it had carried soldiers back from the edge. When I finished, the room rose in applause, and then from the corner I saw her, Sienna, standing clapping first. It was a small gesture, but it rippled through the crowd. For once, she wasn't speaking for me. She was listening. Great Lakes tested me in another way. Mud clung to boots. Recruits stumbled through the obstacle course, the smell of rust and sweat sharp in the air. A cadet named Willow Tate challenged my presence with blunt words. How could a woman carry command in places built for men? I didn't argue. I ran the course beside her, matching her step for step, barking orders when her squad faltered, pushing until her lungs burned. When we finished, soaked and breathless, she looked at me with something harder than admiration, respect. The word ma'am left her lips without irony. I nodded, once the same way Ezra Cole had done for me years before. The Pentagon was marble and light, a cathedral of authority. Admiral Clara Wade pinned the medal on my chest, her words carrying across the hall. She has redefined silence. The weight of the ribbon was less than the weight of the lives it marked, but in that moment it felt like balance. After the ceremony, my father approached. His voice, once iron against me, cracked. I was wrong, he said, eyes wet. I thought your silence was cold. It was steel. I didn't answer. I only inclined my head, the gesture that had always been mine. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need language. A small hand tugged at my uniform. Ember Holt, daughter of a man I had pulled from fire, stared up with eyes too wide for her face. My mom says I'm a little steel flower, she whispered before wrapping her arms around my leg. The memory of Portland rain, of wilted flowers taped to my locker, flashed in my mind. The cycle had broken. A new one had begun. Later that night, an email blinked onto my screen. From Sienna, we salute iron. No apology, no explanation, just acknowledgement. It was enough. I ended my journey where it had begun, at a wall. The Pentagon's memorial shimmered under low lights, rows of names carved deep. I found Leo Brooks, the man whose note had changed me forever. I pressed my palm to the engraving, cold stone grounding me. Iron flowers bloom in silence, I whispered words meant only for him. The legacy I carried was not in medals or applause. It lived in cadets like Willow, in children like Ember, in every soldier who had learned that silence could be sanctuary instead of sentence. My story was never about the noise my sister made or the headlines that tried to shape me. It was about what endured when the noise was gone. Steel Bloom was not just a name. It was proof that storms could carve beauty out of iron, and that even in silence, flowers could rise.